Stephanie, are you seeing any participants yet?
No, we will not see them. We will literally just believe that they are there.
I
And
guess I'm looking at usually there's a number.
there is a number located at the bottom left of your screen. It says 78 right
Oh,
now, but the
good.
cameras are disabled. So we'll
Good.
have that approximate, but no smiling faces.
Very good. Okay.
For some reason, it made me re-register to get that.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to begin today's critical conversation with prayer. And as you know, February is designated Black History Month in this country, and it's a month of celebration on our campus. This is our first critical conversation for the month, and it is dedicated to an important topic in Black history. After I have prayer, I will turn over the floor to Stephanie Guster, who is the Special Advisor for Diversity on Southern's campus. And she will do a brief introduction of our guest today, and then we will begin our program. So let us all pray. Our gracious Heavenly Father, we ask that you will be with us today. And we claim that promise that because we have asked, that you will be here, and that you will bless our speakers, and that you will bless also our participants. And we thank you for hearing our prayer. Amen. Stephanie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Negron. Again, I also want to extend a welcome to those of you who are joining us via this webinar. As an introduction to Black History Month, we are very excited to be able to virtually host the Slave Food Project this morning. I want to let you know that this is part one in a two-part series. We have the privilege of welcoming our guest this morning again next week on campus as well via another webinar. So we hope that you'll be inspired today, that you'll learn some information. I have my pen ready. Though I'm serving as moderator, I'm also here as a student because I want to learn, and I hope that you brought that spirit with you as well. And I would like to introduce to you, who they may be familiar to some of you, but to those who are not familiar with the Slave Food Project, I want to introduce Dr. Eric Walsh and Dr. Columbus Baptiste. Dr. Eric Walsh serves as Medical Director for Urgent Care Services. He has double doctorates in medicine and public health, and he is passionate about educating people on ways to improve their mental, physical, and spiritual health. And he's taken his passion for better health to speak around the world now, so more than ever, I imagine, in a virtual context, speaking maybe even further than when able to get on a plane, and has partnered with his longtime friend, Dr. Columbus Baptiste, who is a board certified interventional cardiologist based in Southern California. And he received his bachelor's degree in biochemistry at Oakwood University and his MD at Loma Linda University. And Dr. Baptiste strives to help people live a healthier lifestyle through his work. And they have combined their efforts and their passions into this nonprofit that ultimately is encouraging health and wellness by providing information on the essential tools needed to live a better lifestyle. We extend a virtual warm welcome to Dr. Batiste and Dr. Walsh and their willingness to share. I do want to mention to attendees that we have enabled the Q&A tab, and we want to leave about 10 minutes at the end of our time today for questions and answers. And so if in your listening to their presentation to us, a question comes up, please feel free to enter that into the Q&A tab, which is there to the bottom lower right-hand side of the Zoom panel, and we will attempt to include those at the conclusion of our time today. Dr. Batiste and Dr. Walsh, the time is yours, and we welcome you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be with you all, and the kind introductions and the opportunity to speak to our brethren at Southern University. Go ahead and take a few moments to share.
Yeah, thank you guys, and thanks for the intro. My cousin graduated from Southern, so I have some fond memories. Although Columbus and I are Oakwoodites, we do love Southern, and I'm very glad to be joining you guys.
All right, so let's dive into it. We want to give you what we're calling Whet Your Appetite. This project that is a message of love, it's a message of hope, it's a message of information that we want to provide to individuals in this thing called the Slave Food Project itself. And so let's dive into things here. And so what we know is we know that we've all been faced with tremendous upheaval over the past year. As this is clear reference of it, the fact that we're doing this presentation virtually, as the world has been transformed by this thing called the COVID virus. And it's brought about it many tragedies. Many things have come to light in the year 2020 as we enter into 2021, and it's still persistent, is what we're seeing. And as a result, one of the things that it's uncovered is it's uncovered that America is living sicker and dying sooner than other areas of the world. So when we look at statistics just specific to COVID-19, we find that America, this great power that we are, this innovation, technology, the things that I do procedurally, it's awe-inspiring. And so we have these resources, but yet we trail as it pertains to the outcomes that we're looking towards. And so we've seen this. We've seen it's uncovered the fact that chronic disease burden inside of America is at an all-time high, where 6 out of 10 individuals have at least one chronic disease. 4 out of 10 individuals have 2 or more chronic diseases. Nearly 75% of prescriptions are sold in America, is what we're finding. We're seeing that Americans are living sicker and dying sooner. But the thing that COVID and the coronavirus really has brought out the inequities, that in communities of color, of Black and brown individuals, it's exposed what has been underneath the surface for many, many years, the fact that there are inequities in care. There's inequities that exist as it pertains to the health outcome. And it leads us to one simple question, and that question is, why is it that Black people in America die sicker and sooner than other people? And so as we dive into this a bit more, this is where we go.
So one of the interesting things is when you look at a city like Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, we find that you actually see pretty large disparities in life expectancy depending on where you live. Traditionally, we would always talk about being at the Capitol Heights section of town compared to being out in Maryland. And what you find is that for like every mile you travel, life expectancy increases by about 1.5 years. By the time you get all the way out to the Shady Grove station in Maryland, life expectancy can be as much as 20 years different. And you should not get these different life expectancies just based on zip code. But what we're learning is that zip code may actually be more important than your genetic code. And so you see these huge differences. In fact, for African-American health, 50% more are more likely to have heart disease than white people, 40% more likely to die at an early age from any cause, and 19% could not afford to see a doctor. So we see that there are real and serious changes, and it translates obviously to life expectancy. And you can see the shortest lived group in America are African-American men. When I was working in public health in California, the county of Los Angeles did this. The shortest living men who didn't live on average to 70 years old were African-Americans in LA County, African-American men. The longest living people were Asian females. So huge disparities in health when you look at it that way. And so there's studies. So way back in 1990, Otten and his colleagues reported death rates per 100,000 in the group of 35 to 54-year-olds. So that's an important number. So you're removing the higher risk young adolescents and the more likely to die over 54. And they found that in this age group, the death rate per 100,000 was 2.3 times higher for African Americans. You adjust for 6 risk factors. So people say, well, Black people smoke more, they have higher blood pressure, higher cholesterol, they're heavier, they drink more alcohol, or they're more likely to have diabetes. And even when you adjust all of those things out, it's 1.9 times higher, so almost double still. So when you add in income, because people will say, well, it's because Black people are poorer, it's still only 1.4 times, which leaves about a third of the difference unexplained. And when you even look at our celebrities, what you see is that everyone from Heavy D to Chadwick Boseman and Dr. Batiste added this guy in the middle from, I don't know who he is as well. he can chime in, but I'm sure he's a newer star. Why I don't know. But you can see here, even when you control for poverty, it still leaves about 38,000 deaths per year, or about 1.1 million years of life lost among African Americans in the United States.
Yeah, so it brings about the question. In reality, is and I have to say, my daughter made me kind of add in someone that she could resonate with in terms of individual who passed away, a Disney star at an early age. But what do racial disparities really mean? And so when we look at this, it's a massive unnecessary loss of death. And so studies in Levine and all, they show that roughly it estimates out to about 265 deaths every single day, or equal to a plane crashing every day, are what health disparities account for. In the words of David Williams from Harvard, it's every 7 minutes, a Black person in America dies prematurely due to health disparities. Now, this is not a Black issue. It's not an African-American issue. This is indeed an American issue, because we see the amount of years lost, the amount of cost on a societal level: $35 billion in excess healthcare expenditures, $10 billion in illness-related lost productivity, and $200 billion in premature deaths. Substantial and significant. Why do Black people die sicker and sooner?
Well, the way we approach this is we look at one of the major causes of disease, morbidity, and mortality, and that is stress. And what we find is that when you look at stress, stress is something that clearly can cause disease. We define it this way: stress is a condition or feeling experienced when a person perceives that demands exceed the personal and social resources the individual is able to mobilize. So you're stressed out when you can't mobilize up to the problems you have. And we actually put together an equation. It says stress equals demands minus resources. So the more demands you have, now when you're poorer, when you're dealing with other issues, you get more demands and you often have less resources. So a net increase in stress. And so what that does is it puts you into the fight or flight mode. That's what stress does. So we're all familiar with this. This is called allostasis. A dog is chasing you. I grew up in kind of in and out of the hood. And when you're running through, when you're going through the hood, sometimes the dogs are chasing you. It's not like California where they put the dogs in a little bag and feed them snacks and all this. Now these dogs were designed to protect the house. And if you fooled around and got too close to them, they were coming for you. We were fearfully and wonderfully made. So you get this adrenaline rush. You can jump the fence easier. You run faster. You think more quickly. Blood is shunted away from your digestive tract to your big muscles. Your heart rate goes up. Your blood pressure goes up. Your liver makes sugar. On and on and on. All of these great changes. The problem is, if every day it feels like you're being chased by the dog, you get chronic stress, and that has consequences. That is called the allostatic load. Not allostasis, but allostatic load. And when that happens, the chronic exposure to stress, poor social supports, limited social networks, all have been shown to increase disease risk.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about this, before I kind of hand the baton back off to Dr. Walsh, is the fact that we've really been faced with this in 2020.
Yeah.
As we think about the stress, we look at the fact that people have engaged in social isolation as opposed to just physical isolation, this limited social networks, and we're seeing an increased disease risk that's persistent.
So just having a low perceived control is a determinant of heightened stress responses and poor adaptation. We'll talk probably a little bit more about the stress hormone cortisol in a minute. And so even when you look here, self-reported job control and heart disease, so you think who has more likely to have heart disease? There's a lot of studies published. You'd think it might be the CEO of the company or the president of the university. It's actually the guy in the mailroom or the guy cutting the grass or the guy, you know, the one who would be first to be laid off or has the least input in what's going to happen at the job. They're more likely to have the heart attack because they have a different type of stress. And so here's social support at work as a risk factor for poor mental health. And you can see here, those with high social support at work do better. Those with low social support at work do worse in terms of mental health outcomes and poor mental health. Also, adversity and vulnerability, along with psychological markers such as low self-esteem and loneliness, are also associated with poor health outcomes. One of the things African Americans face is often low self-esteem. And part of that has traditionally gone back to what is the image of beauty in the country. And for the longest time, it was blonde hair, blue eyes. And so, you know, if you had thicker lips, thicker nose, curlier, kinkier hair, all of those things were considered to be not attractive. And if, for any of us African American, you've had experiences where you've basically been told, I have been told, you'd be so good looking if you just weren't so dark. And these things really impact the psychology of a person and contributes to chronic stress. And since racism is a statement about a person's value, resources most often go where value is perceived. So if stress equals demands minus resources, the less value you give to a group of people, the less resources those people will get. And that is one of the reasons why you'll see some of these disease patterns that we see. But there's a unique stressor. And that unique stressor is racism itself. And when collectively African Americans see the deaths of a young person by the hands of the police, you can try and justify it, not justify it. What happens is collectively everyone's stress levels go up because we have sons and we are African American males or Latino males even who are at higher risk of having deaths at the hands of the police or from other causes. This collective unique stressor can cause disease.
And we see this, I'm gonna jump in, we see this really in terms of people say, well, you know, that doesn't resonate with me. But let's just stop for a second. So there's something called the everyday discrimination scale. And you ask yourself, are you frequently treated with less courtesy than others? Are you frequently treated with less respect? Do you frequently receive poor service? You know, or do you frequently have people think you're not smart, or people are afraid of you, or people act like you're dishonest, or that people act like they're better than you? This is called the everyday discrimination scale, or these are called microaggressions, micro discriminations that erode at your level. I've experienced it. I remember just a matter of 3 weeks ago, walking into, as a matter of fact, it was right after the storming of the Capitol. I remember walking into the operating room to get a pair of shoe covers and a cup of personal protective equipment. And as I walked in, I'm looking through and there's bustling all around me, everyone. I'm the only person who looked like myself. And someone walked up to me who didn't recognize me and they said, excuse me, what are you doing here? Do you belong here? Are you supposed to be getting this? And in that moment, I began to wonder, well, are they saying this because of who I am when everyone's walking and grabbing this, because of who they see me as? And so this level can have an impact on you. This level of stress can have a distinct impact on you. And so we see this manifest. We see this manifest as stress, racism as stress. And so women who said they faced racial discrimination on the job and in housing from the police were 48% more likely to develop breast cancer than those who reported no incidents of major discrimination. Another study of African American women found that those who reported chronic emotional stress due to their experiences of racism had more severely blocked carotid arteries. So for those of you who may not know, those are the vessels that deliver blood to the brain that lead to strokes and issues there. Other studies have shown that an increase in coronary calcium scores, a marker of coronary artery disease, and we know was the #1 killer of all Americans by a heightened sense in African Americans is what we see. So it tells us beyond a shadow of a doubt that yes, indeed, our health is equal to not only another equation, our resiliency divided by our stress. The higher our stress, the poorer our health. The higher our stress, the poorer our health. And so what do many people turn to when they get stressed? What do you do when you're feeling down? What do you do when you're feeling depressed? What happens in those particular instances? We oftentimes, I like to joke in many instances and say we go on a double date with our friends Ben and Jerry, and that we begin to engage in certain activities that bring us a sense of comfort. And we know this, that some have ascribed this to a palindrome, that stressed equals dessert spelled backwards. It equals dessert spelled backwards. And that leads us into another area that we have explored, which is once again, health equals resiliency over stress, that every action either adds to our resiliency or adds to our stress. And there is indeed a nutritional stress. What is nutritional stress? Nutritional stress is, of course, we know it's eating disease forming foods, but it's also not eating health promoting foods. It's an absence of certain nutrients in our body, phytochemicals. It's the absence of this that leads to it. And so many in the community, they feel that they have a different legacy, that soul food is their legacy, or that this food is their legacy that may be anything but health promoting, Dr. Walsh.
And so we know that there's a different legacy. And I've been fortunate enough to travel around Africa. And when you look at some of the markets that I stumble upon in places like Ghana and Zambia, it is not packaged factory-made foods. It's a lot of whole food, root foods, fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, cooked in many different ways. In fact, Africa has super vegetables, long overlooked in parts of Africa. Indigenous greens are now capturing attention for their nutritional and environmental benefits. We just had a young lady of Nigerian descent on our last Slave Food Project conversation last Friday night, and she went through some of these, and it was actually quite powerful, the health benefits of the foods that Africans ate before they went into diaspora. And so it's super high in nutrients, those foods. But what happened? There was something called the Middle Passage, and in that process, human beings were turned into commodities, and food was an important way that happened. When I was in Ghana, I was able to go to one of the slave castles, and the way that they would feed the slaves was to punish, to reinforce certain behaviors. It was used as a way to control or to starve people off. I mean, it was absolutely horrible. The rations were scientifically calculated so that you could provide just the least amount of nutrition possible to the enslaved people, especially on the ship. And if the slave captain wanted to make more money, he just pulled back on what he gave them and in terms of rations. But as Africans traveled and established in the West, on islands like Puerto Rico and Jamaica, in places like Brazil and here in North America, what you find is that many different things began to happen. Slaves often were issued what was considered to be the lesser cut of the hog, such as the feet, the head, the ribs, the fat back, or the internal organs. This is where we get chitlings from, and now as people view it as a delicacy. But Frederick Douglass wrote about this. Food and nutrition was weaponized as a way to control the slaves. Frederick Douglass recounted, and this is a quote from him: rations consisted of a monthly allowance of a bushel of a third-rate corn, pickled pork, which was often tainted, and poorest quality herrings, barely enough to sustain grown men and women through the back-breaking labors in the field. It was enough food so you could work from can't see morning to can't see night, but it was not enough food for you to be able to rise up and rebel against the master or try and flee. So oh, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, great. Yeah. When we came into the turn of the 20th century, one of the things that we identified was that Sundays and the weekends became like an area of celebration, an opportunity where rations were oftentimes given on Saturdays. And there was a time in which slaves were able to come together over a dinner table and for that brief moment feel as if they were free. And so it became a sense of celebration, bringing their best and so forth during this time and accentuating these foods. As they began to migrate out, as the racisms and the post and the Jim Crow era began to migrate out of the South. My folks from Louisiana into California and others to different locations, this period between 1950 and 1970, they migrated across carrying with them, but all of a sudden their ability to grow food and that resiliency diminished. And so they became early adopters of fast food, some of the early adopters of eating street-based foods. And as the living conditions shifted, And they're inside of these massive buildings with limited access to cooking. They were forced into frying and quick boiling for the meats and things of that nature that shifted the eating pattern even further as this began to evolve. It takes us up into the precipice of the civil rights era. And in the civil rights era, there became this acknowledgement of the history, this past history, and to embrace it in terms of the foods that were eaten and cultivated, making lemonade out of lemons. But during this period of time, as civil unrest shook the United States, it was our president, Richard Nixon, who said, listen, any act of racism is an act of communism. And he began to shift the tide and began to say, we need to rebuild these areas that are there and instill businesses, and began to deliver small business association loans that were lent out predominantly to fast foods companies because of profit margin, and liquor stores and things of that nature that inside of these communities of color. In a sense, developing what can also be known, Dr. Zhao from Australia, in an excellent book called Supersizing Urban America. It's what ended up happening and leading to, as Dr. Walsh alludes to a lot of times, the weaponization of food.
And with this came the idea that you could use nutrition to do the same thing that was done on the slave plantation or in the ship. You can make great profits from it, but at the same time, not feed people to become the best they possibly could be by feeding cheap processed foods. Michael Pollan calls it in some of his books, food-like substances, Twinkies and honey buns and Cheetos and Takis and all this stuff. What happens is you get such low levels of phytonutrients, you don't stimulate the brain the same way. You don't get the proper brain function. And so these foods are literally now allowed to exaggerate and accelerate the stress process that we talked about earlier. Food itself can do that and accelerate disease. So what happens? Well, after the urban areas became a windfall of money for fast food restaurants, the fast food industry today is like $170 billion industry. And in great ways, they set up shop in low-income communities. They cluster neighborhoods with 30% fewer supermarkets, and these produce what we call food deserts, where there's no real nutrients, no real food. But on the other side, it does create what we call food swamps, where there's all of these low nutrient, calorie dense foods flooding into inner city areas all over the United States. And the more available fast food is, the more likely it is that people in that neighborhood are going to have heart attacks.
This is an area that's close and personal to me. What we know that if a person on average from University of Minnesota, if they partake of fast food once a week, they increase their risk of having a heart attack by nearly 20%. If they're ingesting fast food on average 2 or 3 times per week, then they're increasing their risk of a heart attack by 40 to 50%. 4 or more times, they're increasing their risk nearly up to 80% in a study that was performed there. And so there's such power just by living in close proximity, as well as which tells you about your resources, getting into stress equals demands minus resources in our health equation as well, that there's power in our choices and the things that we're eating.
One of the things that we see happen, of course, is there's a lot of money to spent to target Black youth. We've had programs where we talk to people and they say, white and Black, and they say, listen, when I tried Dr. Pepper at 7 or 8 years old, that was it. I was hooked. And they say, I'm 45 years old. I still drink Dr. Pepper. People know that if you can get a kid hooked on it, if you get a kid to like it, you get them. And so there's a lot of money spent advertising to African-American children, to Latino children. And when you look at it, $135 million, fast food, restaurants, candy, sugar, soft drinks, targeting Black targeted TV channels, $2 million for yogurt and juice, $0 for plain water, fruits and vegetables. So we know that television is successful. There are great studies that show that what you watch, and we as Christians talk about by beholding you become changed. If this is what you're exposed to, it will change the way you do it. They wouldn't spend this money if they didn't know it was effective.
Absolutely. And so we know even there's a great book out called Salt, Sugar, and Fat. And in that, Michael Moss gives a behind the scenes, unfolds the veil. And he describes the CEO of, at that time, General Foods. His name was Charles Mortimer. And Charles Mortimer was trying to rally his troops into developing products that people would love. And he said, listen, my kids asked for cake for breakfast. Give them cake for breakfast. And we see now that this is indeed what we're having. We're having donuts and we're having milkshakes for breakfast in the form of what we're saying are smoothies. And we're having these things and we're increasing these food substances that are food-like substances. One of the things as we see integrated inside this system, we described already about how tax dollars may go to fund certain areas that will have increased amounts of fast food locations. We also know that our tax dollars go into something called the dairy checkoff. And this is a system where our tax dollars go and they assist in funding the advertisement for these foods, for the fast food companies. They actually go in and they're doing. So we have this interplay that now as we see cheesy stuff, pizzas and extra layered burgers and French fries, that these things are actually our tax dollars that are going to subsidize the advertisement that may be targeted to certain communities, but targeted in America as a whole. It's powerful.
And it's really important to remember that cheese all by itself, the casein, one of the proteins in cheese, breaks down to something called casomorphones, which are actually low-grade addictive substances related to kind of like heroin. So when you think about that, there's the question, does this prime the brain to later on want drugs and alcohol and other things? And so we look at it, the hypocrisy of the government kind of goes on when you look at the food dietary guidelines versus the federal food subsidies. What do they tell us to eat is on the left. What they actually subsidize is on the right. So our tax dollars actually go against what they actually tell us to eat. And here's the thing, and the food dietary guidelines aren't ideal as it is. And then on top, so then the money goes somewhere else, which tells you a lot about what's actually happening here.
And we look at that lobbying. And so when we look at these subsidies, and what the importance of subsidies is that obviously there's a certain level, and it's very complicated, and it's not clearly one-to-one, but what we find is this plays a significant role in the lower costs. So you ever wonder, why is it that it costs me more to buy a salad out inside of at a restaurant or in the cafeteria maybe even, right? And I can have 5 burgers for $1.50, or I can have a pizza, 5 pizzas for $1, right? Why is there this difference? Well, there's layers. So let's follow the money trail. We know that there are small business association loans that potentially are administered. We know that there is federal subsidies that are given that lower the cost of the food sold in these areas. And we know that there's federal dollars that go into advertisement. And so we're creating these crucibles of conflict. And so how does it play out? What do studies tell us? What do medical studies tell us? Well, they tell us distinctly. The Journal of American Medical Association, Internal Medicine, told us a study that the higher consumption of foods derived from subsidized commodities were associated with increased cardiometabolic events and outcomes in US adults. What are those? We talk about increased obesity. We speak to increased blood pressure. We speak to diabetes. We speak to heart disease and heart failure. It all ties in distinctly as we look at this vicious cycle that exists there and leads to what was represented inside of a large scale study that stemmed from Birmingham, Alabama, the Regard study, which showed the increased disparities related to the Southern style eating pattern, an increased level of hypertension, of Alzheimer's disease, of heart disease that are there from eating high consumption of overly processed, refined foods, fried and organ meats there. What these foods do, and Dr. Walsh describes this extremely well.
I think it's kind of funny because the tobacco industry was sued because they said their product was not addicting, and of course it turned out to be and caused all this disease. So they were sued, and the litigation was successful against them. The food industry doesn't hide it. They say, listen, bet you can't eat just one. Once you pop, you can't stop. There's a McDonald's billboard we use in some of our talks that says, crafted for your cravings. They've designed the food this way. And how do they do it? They mix processed sugar with processed fats and tons of salt. And by doing this, they mix these things together and it creates a dopamine rush in the brain. It does something else. We talked about cortisol being the stress hormone that happens when you have the fight or flight response. These foods often, they stall the release of cortisol. So you actually feel better. They change the mood. They study things like the bliss point, how much sugar gets you to the right place, that the right crunch They even have a thing called like vanishing calories, so that you eat like a cheese puff and it crunches, but then it turns the powder and just melts in your mouth. So your brain is saying, hey, I heard a crunch, as if there was an apple or a piece of celery going to be eaten, but then nothing comes behind it. It's just powder. And so you say, man, I'm not full. I need more. I need more. I need more. Designed to do this. And so this is the way that they manufacture food addiction. So when we talk about slave food, the one hand, we talk about its historical context and what it means, but in its broader application, this is the way that people become slaves to food. This is the way that we become hooked, where we eat for emotional charge. And there's a great saying I give in some of my sermons that says this: God made the human heart so big that only he can fill it. The food industry thinks that they can fill the emotional, social pains in your life by feeding you tastier and tastier, more addictive food. But the truth of the matter is, you'll never see the bottom of it. You'll have to eat forever. This food is designed to draw us in and hold us captive. And by doing this, it causes incredible amounts of disease.
Yes, yes. So this is part one of our talk, what we wanted to walk you through briefly in a high level fashion and give you essentially a taste, an appetizer of some of the things that we speak to as we walk you through the historical connotation of slave food. We walk you through how environmentally individuals, oftentimes we tell them that they have a choice, make better choices, but they're riddled and living in environments in which they have no choice. We tell folks, oh, just purchase better foods, but yet we see they live in environments where the foods that are available are subsidized and at a level that they can afford, based upon that we didn't speak on this particular talk, the WIC and some other aspects that are there. And then we speak to the connotation of the way the food industry is really crafted. What we're hopeful to bring out inside part two is bring more of the science to you, to really let you know on a physiologic level how these foods and the components, as we alluded to already, they heighten our stress hormone cascade, that they lead to progressive disease and they change the mood of individuals that are out there. But we thank you and we look forward to presenting the next phase of this in the upcoming series.
I wish you could see my notes. I said I was going to come as a student, and I have scrawled as much as I possibly could. There is one question in the chat pod, specifically someone interested in a resource for the data about fast foods versus heart attacks. Is there a particular study that you could reference to guide that participant who wants to go back and do some more reading about that?
Absolutely. So I can provide you as far as in a written connotation. It's a study that was done at University of Minnesota now, probably about 5 to 7 years ago, where they looked. It was sample size of probably about 200 to 400 individuals, somewhere in that range there, where they were able to extrapolate out looking longitudinally at the ill effects. So I'll provide that in follow-up, along with several other references. A great book for you to look into too as well, which highlights this very well, is in a book by Dr. Joel Fuhrman. It's called The End of Heart Disease, where he's written and he really uncovers and layers out in detail many of these instances.
One participant, I'm smiling as I read this question, said, and I quote, "I was on board until you messed with my cheese puffs. Have mercy, Lord." Help us understand just a little bit, Drs. Batiste and Hall, the difficulty of translating this type of information. We may be planning to cover some of this next week, but hearing this shocking data, how would you recommend we begin to process it? What do we do after hearing this?
Let me say that when we're speaking to a group like this that are people of faith, there's weapons in your arsenal that others don't have. We're told that by beholding we become changed. The reason we love some of these foods so much is because that's what we've been exposed to, and they fill a void in our lives in terms of pleasure and even, again, stress relief. And the reason you get this guttural response to not having it is the same kind of guttural response someone addicted to a drug would have when you say, "Listen, you've got to give this drug up." Similar kind of guttural response. So for those who are looking to begin to change their diet, one of the things we say is start away from the table. We'll talk more about this next week. And also find natural, healthy foods to replace these processed foods. These processed foods all of the nutrients have been taken out in order for them to have longer shelf life so that they make the companies more money. So they withdraw all of the nutrients. And so we always say they're food-like substances because they don't even spoil. Literally, you can take a Happy Meal, and they have this on the internet, sit it up there for 2 years and pull it down, and it looks exactly the same. And that's because even the bacteria and the fungus realize it's not real food. So you've got to ask yourself, if you eating stuff the bacteria and the fungus won't eat, what are you really doing?
Mercy.
And that's how you got to begin this process of awakening away from some of these foods.
Wonderful. Thank you for that response. Another question for students. We have a number of students on our campus who are looking to take the route that you have both taken. They want to be MDs, they want to be doctors. What would you say to students who are interested in medicine, the connection to this data?
I think data is robust. So this marrying, I think one of the ways in which medical education has failed in the past is that it's failed to really look at the beneficial outcomes of lifestyle, of simple things that have been taught inside our Adventist church for eons of time, in terms of trusting God, in terms of sunlight, in terms of exercise, in terms of nutrition, that there's actually power. It's not just discussion that happens inside the church. There's actually power from a research standpoint. So I would encourage any individual seeking to go into medicine, first of all, is to embrace a similar type fashion of embracing the lifestyle, because it's going to be beneficial. It's going to heighten. There's studies that we bring out that talk about the benefits of simple things like berries and in studying. We talk about of sleep. We know the power of sleep and day of rest and daily sleep for the power of learning and cementing in your the aspects of the human body. But mostly importantly, I'd say that you stay connected to God, and that you would stay intentional in your efforts to be a tool, a weapon of change, right? The weapon of change. Go ahead.
And let me jump in and say this, that we have been told that this message is the right arm of the gospel. So any of you who are going to leave and go off to places like Loma Linda, even Montemorelos down in Mexico, or anywhere else to medical school. I went to the University of Miami in Florida. I want you to go in with the mission that this is not just something you do because you've been called, you want to be a physician, you find science interesting, you want to be a doctor. It is a calling, and you are able to impact people's lives. And I really admire Dr. Batiste. He's an interventional cardiologist. They do very well with doing procedures and prescribing medications. So it's not usual for a cardiologist to be speaking about healthier ways to live in order to prevent ever seeing him in the first place. And I think any one of you that is going into medicine should really be looking at, how do I create the kind of patient population that ultimately doesn't really need me? And that comes from our own health message as Adventists.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful responses. Thank you for that. One additional question. For some people, the term food desert is new. Can you unpack what that means and how prevalent those are, and what we should do about them? Give us the skinny on food deserts.
I'll let Columbus go after me. Let me jump in real quick and just say, I worked on this a lot on the ground, and when I worked in public health. Food deserts, what happens is, it's a weird thing because we have food deserts and food swamps, and the word food is loosely used. The food desert means you can go up the street, and when I was working in Pasadena, California, and even here in Hartford, Connecticut, where I'm at now, you go to certain parts of town and all you see are Popeyes, Kentucky Fried, McDonald's, Burger King, in Cali, it's Jack in the Box and the other ones. You go up the street in a poor black and brown neighborhood, and what you see is fast food joint after fast food joint after fast food joint. You go into the bodegas or the corner stores, you see nothing but junk food. So there's tons of food, as it were, but there's very little nutrition. So there's not a lot of real food. So there's a food desert because you're not getting fresh tomatoes and apples and oranges and grapes and blueberries, bananas and greens. You're not getting all of the different types of vegetables that exist in the cruciferous family. You're not getting that. If you do get nuts, you're getting them salted and fried. You're getting everything processed. So there's not enough real food, whole food, healthy food, but there's a swamp. There's a ton of food just being flooded into these neighborhoods because, like, when I was growing up, and my single mother, if she wanted us to celebrate, we would go to McDonald's to celebrate, right? That's a food, that's the food swamp side of it. And both sides work together to cause disease.
I'll only add in just these food insecurities are prevalent, and they're prevalent across the country. And so for anyone who's interested in more information, you definitely can follow us at slavefood.org. You can follow us on social media with many of the lectures where we really peel through the layers of these concepts on an individual level and give insight to it.
Wonderful. I think my last question, looking at the time, can you speak to maybe or not there's a connection with the decline in agriculture and maybe the increase in food deserts? Not everybody might be interested in growing a tomato or a head of lettuce, but is that maybe an equality issue? Should we look at embracing that aspect of the gospel to try and grow our own food?
I would say definitely. And I would argue one of the things that we talk about when we talk to churches is one of the things you could do as a community outreach is a community garden. You can actually host, if you have a gymnasium or a large space, you can actually host once a month a form of a farmer's market and find ways to offer healthy, fresh foods to people in the neighborhood. Many of us as Adventists, African-American Adventists, commute into inner cities to go to church. It'd be powerful if we lobbied our resources to bring in whole foods, fresh foods as part of our health message. It makes no sense to go into the inner city and say, hey, everybody needs to be vegetarian, and we never show them a vegetable. Right? Instead, we show them processed veggie meats instead. So we have a work to do around that I think is very meaningful in these end days.
Wonderful. Thank you for that response. Another question that came in from a student: in school, I received free lunch. Is there research on free and reduced lunch in public schools and effects on health later in life? Simply, do we learn unhealthy eating habits not only at home, but are they reinforced then in schools? Have mercy.
I'll let Columbus take that one if he wants to.
Yeah, no, there's a ton of information. And so that's a wonderful, powerful question, because we've seen a lot of these issues arise during COVID right now, where kids have been forced to revert to homeschooling, and many of them rely upon the school system for their food in general. But we also see at another level, same as we see for the WIC, Women, Infant, and Children program, that we may see that the foods that are available or that are touted inside these areas are driven by lobbyists, by big business, that where you're seeing pizza companies and you're seeing soft drink companies really bring their foods inside of schools to kids, building that brand recognition like Dr. Walsh spoke about earlier, that we're seeing the dairy industry that's there. I was watching the NFL Network. I'm a sports fan. Sorry about the Titans out there. But but one of the things that I heard them say was, be fit and drink your milk for protein. Eat your dairy for protein. And so we're giving mixed messages as it pertains to health and wellness and outcomes in communities across the board.
Certainly, and you do have a sports lover in me as well, and I think it's interesting with Super Bowl Sunday coming up. Tom Brady has been recognized for his, some people call it unsustainable, insane plant-based diet that he tries to focus on. He even had a guacamole recipe and said, if you're going to eat guacamole for Super Bowl, don't eat it with the chips. And so I think you're right. You know, we do have evidence of individuals who are embracing this aspect of the message, if you will, that I think could inspire us. I cannot thank you both enough. I see Dr. Negron reminding me of the time. It's been rich, it's been inspiring, and definitely has made me want to come back next week to hear part 2. Dr. Negron, any closing thoughts for us?
Well, everyone, I hope you have enjoyed the presentation. And if you have, we invite you to come back next week for part 2. Same time, same channel.
Same time, same channel, and go get a salad for lunch.
Do eat a salad. Yes.
Dr. Negron, will you close this with prayer?
I'm sorry, did you say me?
Yes, would you close us with prayer?
Yes, yes. Let us pray. Gracious Heavenly Father, as we go our various directions, we thank you for the wisdom that has been given us through Dr. Baptiste and Dr. Walsh. And Lord, may we have the wisdom to apply what we've learned to our lives. We ask for a blessing on our afternoons, and may all that we do and say glorify you. It's my prayer in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen. Again, a special thank you to our presenters, and we look forward to seeing you back next week. And those students who are signed in, please know that we will get you credit for attending. We will have a report that will go to student development, so don't worry about how we will know you were here. We will have a way for that, and blessings on everyone's afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, and God bless.